Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. And I'd like to welcome you to our event tonight, Report on Reports, a roadmap for U.S. global leadership. We are so excited to be partnering with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition here tonight and to be hearing from Liz Schrayer on the report that they put out outlining 6 key areas of consensus on foreign policy and how to move forward. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to talk a little bit about the Council, who we are and what we do. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is dedicated to helping people better understand complex global issues. We do that through speakers programs, international exchanges, and high school education programs. We are a nonpartisan organization, and for that reason, any of the comments here tonight do not necessarily reflect those of the Council, its board members, staff, supporters, donors, or members. We are here as a platform for you to hear from experts about important global issues, and we hope that you take the opportunity to take the information you hear tonight and formulate your own opinions. I wanted to take a moment to bring on stage one of our board members, Susan von Hemert, to talk a little bit about why she is involved with our organization.
Hello, my name is Susan von Hemert, and I joined the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire last year. My interest in international affairs began more than 20 years ago while working in global healthcare. I saw firsthand the challenges other countries face in providing care to their citizens, and I gained a better understanding of these problems and issues we have in common with the rest of the world through lived experiences. I became a member of the Council because after living abroad in France and being exposed to global news, I wanted to continue that link to global affairs after moving to New Hampshire. Membership in the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire did just that and gave me and my family access to important programs to further our knowledge about our place in the global society and how we can make an impact on global peace. I became a board member in 2020 because I believe that global problems are our problems. Through collaboration and exposure to the issues we have in common with the world, we can problem solve through dialogue and idea exchange. The World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is an important organization because it provides insight into concerns that not only face the world, but the United States as well. Our Global Tipping Point series, now being broadcast virtually, offers topics such as China's growing influence in the world, how climate change affects our military, effects of unrest in the Middle East, and our global influence challenges. These educational programs serve to promote understanding of worldwide challenges and how citizens of New Hampshire can become involved in local activities. Our organization's civic involvement and cultural integration serves to promote peace and understanding through these speaker series, and also student academic World Quest competition and the International Visitors Program. By hosting an international visitor in your home, for example, provides them with insight into a real U.S. family and promotes friendships that last far beyond that visit. This has been a challenging year for us, moving from in-person programming to online. Your support of our initiatives enable us to expand and create additional educational programs, as well as support the development of international leaders through our visitors program. Please consider joining our organization to expand your global understanding and learn more about how our world is interconnected.
Thank you, Susan. We really appreciate your support and your passion for our work. I also wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsors for tonight's event. Thank you to Southern New Hampshire University, our mission partner for all of our great events, as well as to Stephen and Karen Barndollar, Helen Taft and Peter Bowman, as well as Janet Prince and Peter Berg. We really appreciate all you do to help make these events possible. I also want to thank all of our wonderful members and donors for the continuing support you give to the organization. So enough from me. I'd like to take the next couple of minutes to introduce our speaker and turn it over to Liz Schrayer. Liz serves as the president and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, a broad-based coalition of over 500 businesses and NGOs that work to advocate for strong U.S. global leadership through development and diplomacy. Under her leadership, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition has grown to a nationwide network of advocates in all 50 states and boasts a bipartisan advisory council led by General Colin Powell. They also have a National Security Advisory Council consisting of nearly 200 retired 3- and 4-star generals. Ms. Schrayer currently serves on the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation's Development Advisory Council, USAID's Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid, as well as several advisory boards and committees for the University of Michigan, her alma mater, including the Ford School of Public Policy. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In addition to running the USGLC, enough in its own right, Ms. Schrayer serves as the president of Schrayer and Associates Incorporated, a nationwide consulting firm founded in 1995, which works on a wide range of domestic and international issues. Liz, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Tim. It is wonderful to be with you tonight. Congratulations on everything that you've done with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. I know there are so many friends of mine that are tuning in tonight. I think Ambassador Bruno and House Member Norelli, my friend Steve Dupree. I don't know who's all on, but I love coming up to New Hampshire. I'm actually in New England tonight, and so I feel like it was just meant to be that we were going to get to talk to one another tonight. So thanks for having me. We are meeting at a pretty complex time and a pretty intriguing time to have this conversation about, a roadmap for U.S. global leadership in the world. It's been an unimaginable, toll on our health and our economy in the midst of the global pandemic. But I feel like as I just was lucky enough to get my second vaccine shot, and maybe with spring coming up, there's hope in the air. But I'm going to dive into our report on reports and how to address some of these big global challenges in the world. But I want to start with just a moment with a story, Tim, to put our discussion in context. And the story I want to tell is that last year, we actually celebrated, you introduced our organization, which has been, thrilled to partner with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire over the years. We celebrated our 25th anniversary. And if you think back, all of you are our World Affairs special experts. So you think back where all of you were 25 years ago. Tim, you were too young. But it was the end of the Cold War. And America won, and a lot of our fellow citizens thought, you know what, we won. We got the Atlantic and the Pacific on both of our coasts, Canada and Mexico in our north and our south. We don't need to be so engaged in the world, and we can pull back. Bad idea. We learned that, back in World War I. And thanks to people like all of you in New Hampshire and friends from around the country, we organized to push back against that isolationist arena. And both Democrats and Republicans in New Hampshire have been terrific. But for our 25th, this is the story I want to tell. I interviewed members of our National Advisory Committee. General Colin Powell, who you mentioned, who's our chair, Condoleezza Rice, Bob Gates, Secretary Albright, et cetera, for a video we did. And one of the people I interviewed was Secretary George Shultz, who has since passed away, and it was just shy of his 100th birthday. And we talked about why America should be engaged in the world. And he kind of looked at me through Zoom, and he said, well, it was simple then, meaning back when he was Secretary of State, and it's simple now. It's just in our economic and security interests. And he says to me, and it's even more so today in the global pandemic. We need diplomacy. We need our economic development toolkits. And it was just so matter of fact of how he talked with me that day. It was such a beautiful and fabulous conversation, how privileged I felt. And it struck me as we start this conversation that, almost very little is bipartisan in Washington, D.C., where I live, except these issues that we're about to talk about tonight, is that here's a place where there is bipartisan agreement that when the world is so chaotic, that one of the tools that we need are development and diplomacy. And you're going to hear me say this throughout my little summary of this report on reports that we're going to talk about. So first, what is it? Let me kind of explain this. So it dates back to 2008. So why 2000? Think about 2008. We actually printed a lot of stuff then. And so there's lots of think tanks and policy institutes that do marvelous work looking at and delivering thoughtful ideas. But in 2007 and 8, they still printed big, heavy kind of phone book ideas. So they were sending them to the incoming administration, actually before they knew if it was a Democrat or Republican at that time. And I got a copy of them. And they were literally piling up on my desk. And I thought, how could somebody coming into an administration have time to read them? I could barely read them. And they were recommendations for Congress and the administration on foreign policy and national security, realizing how challenging it would be for anybody to read it. I thought, could we synthesize it? Could we, look and see, of course there's disagreements, but could we find the common ground? Could we actually create a report on the reports, providing a roadmap for policymakers on Capitol Hill and in the administration, showing where there would be agreement on development and diplomacy within the national security space? Report on Reports was launched. And what's so interesting is over the years, there's been these impressive results where we actually have shown consensus. And over the past decade, we have calculated that there's been 50 bipartisan pieces of legislation signed into law. And I'm not going to take full credit from these Report on Reports, but a lot of the ideas that were passed into law by Congress, signed by whichever administration was in power at the time, are really grounded in these consensus. So let's look at these reports. Every 4 years, there's different, reflecting the moments in time. This report is obviously unlike any other because it's in the backdrop of the global pandemic, an ultimate reminder of literally what happens overseas impacts America's day-to-day life, our health, our safety, our economic interests. So my colleagues were amazing. They read thousands of pages, over 120 reports. They are all US-based think tanks and policy institutes across an entire array of political spectrums. They were all, this is important, written before the election. So that means everybody who wrote them did not know who was going to win. So they weren't, pivoted towards a D or an R. And they were for both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. So we organized them around 6 big global challenges. And they all addressed them. They are quickly fighting the global pandemic, addressing global economic competitiveness, mitigating the impact of climate change, defending against rising authoritarianism, responding to global humanitarian crisis, and the 6th one was influencing global partnership. So 100% there are differences. But what's most interesting is looking where there's agreement, again, as a roadmap to how do you impact the American family. Last thing I'll say before jumping into the substance is our launch event, and we've tried to do this every 4 years, which when we write this report was one of the first, it may have been the first, but I'm not sure, but the first kind of non-press public event that the new National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, participated in. You can watch the actual event on our website. But that was panel 2. Panel 1 was Main Street America, where we had Mayor Stephen Benjamin from Columbia, South Carolina, former Governor Mary Phelan from Oklahoma, Congressman Pete Roscom, Illinois, Michelle Nunn, President of CARE of Georgia. So really interesting to see that conversation. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through rather quickly all 6. I'm going to give you a little bit of flavor of each one, and then in the discussion we can talk more. I'll spend the most time on the first two, and then just give you a touch of flavor of the consensus point of the last four. So, fighting global poverty. So, as you know, here we are. The vaccine rollout is moving forward, but you all know we're not through the pandemic. There's new variants coming out, and as long as no one's safe, as long as this virus is not under control anywhere. I saw in the New York Times the other day that 84% of the shots that are literally going into arms are worldwide are going to high and middle income countries. 0.1% of doses administered are to low-income countries. So that means that worldwide, this thing isn't over. My friend Gail Smith, who was the former USAID administrator, just was appointed yesterday or the day before to vaccine diplomacy for America to really address this. So what does our report show? There's differences. Some want to focus solely on China's role in the outbreak. Others want to make sure that we kind of move the boxes around of how we reform America's global health programs. But here are four consensus areas that I'm all in. One, we have to do way more when it comes to investments in pandemic preparedness. It's not if, it's when there's going to be another pandemic. And we can talk about that. So let's not take our foot off the gas pedal. Let's make sure we stay invested. Two, we have to invest in health systems in the developing world, because we're as weak as the weakest link in this. Three, reforming multilateral efforts. That includes WHO. And with this, a few exceptions, most of the reports want to reform from within rather than reform and pull out. And so just about everybody wants to do within. And the fourth consensus point that I would highlight is to ensure equitable vaccine distribution. And there's a lot of studies out that as long as there's inequitable distribution, the economy is hurt badly, and I can go through many statistics, but that and our health is really under threat. So that's kind of a real quick summary of the global pandemic. The second one I want to spend a little bit of time on, I know we have a lot of business leaders on that are tuned in tonight, is global economic competition. Now, pre-COVID, there was already enormous chatter on the growing global competition coming out of a lot of countries, but particularly China. Since COVID, WTO estimates the global trade just last year declined by 9%. IMF is forecasting that the global economy from COVID we're going to see a loss of $28 trillion of output through 2025. So no surprise that here's what the consensus, again, some differences, but there's a lot of consensus here. First, U.S. has got to up our game when it comes to global engagement in the world economically. We are just, as one person said to me the other day, we're getting, China's eating our lunch. They're out there. We can't stop them, but we sure have to get in the game. So what does the game mean? Well, first, people really want us to renew international efforts to counter China's economic influence. And that means being way more assertive when it says to set standards at places like WTO. Bolster our diplomatic capacity at embassies so that we're promoting more trade and investment. We redid our Development Finance Corporation last year. We should be doing more, not less with it. There's a lot of folks calling for more in places like Africa. One challenge I would call out after I looked at all those reports is that, and this is a challenge to USGLC, and Tim, I would say to the World Affairs Council, is that we've got to do a better job making the case that what happens globally matters locally when it comes to the economy. Last week, I hosted an event with Senator Romney in Utah. There were 60,000 people that tuned into some of the conversation, and the entire hour-long conversation was talking about this competition with China. I know Senator Romney with Senator Hassan actually has a piece of legislation partnering with our allies and in the EU and the Indo-Pacific to counter China. So we got to figure out how to make sure we make that case. The last four I'm going to go through a little quickly because I want to get to the conversation, but I want to give you a flavor of what it said. So on mitigating the impact of climate change, obviously there are differences. Should we, again, this was before the administration, should we or should we not join the Paris Agreement? How do you reduce greenhouse gas emissions? But here's where there's some interesting consensus. On China, this isn't where the competition is. This is where the cooperation is. We actually need to work with China on climate. We need to build resilience within the developing world because that's where they're hit hardest. We need to focus on these climate-driven challenges. Think about hunger, migration that lead to real national security issues. My friend David Beasley, who leads the World Food Program, has said to me, and he's a big conservative. He was a governor of the state of South Carolina. And he said to me, I can battle with my conservative friends all you want of how we got, is climate change real, not change, real or not? He said, but the reality is, let's deal with the consequences. Hunger, migration, it leads to national security issues. The last one I would mention on climate is another interesting one. Multilateralism gets batted around. Is it good? Is it bad? Or is it not? Here, there's a consensus about using multilateral diplomacy to actually make a difference on climate. One challenge I would share with you is, this is a place where in Washington it gets pretty partisan. Senator Shaheen is part of a bipartisan climate caucus in the Senate that's actually getting some stuff done. So this is an area where there may be some promise. Fourth, here's a big bipartisan bucket, battling the rise of authoritarianism. There is Freedom House for the 15th year in a row. Think about this, 15th year in a row. They reported a decline in democratic institutions around the world. USAID's new nominee, Samantha Power, is going to make this a priority to address it. Here's the sweet spots in our report. A widespread agreement that we've got to combat rising authoritarianism. Where do people want to focus on? Strengthening tools of combating election interference and disinformation. A lot of interest in actually coordinating with allies, like on the disinformation coming out of China and Russia. One little rub I would say we need to watch on, we can talk about in the conversation, is that our allies have some differing views on things like digital technology, regulation and privacy issues. They have differing views in terms of how they deal with Russia and China when it comes to economic strategic relations. Fifth one, this one's near and dear to my heart. Responding to the growing humanitarian crisis. Do you know there are more than 235 million people who will need humanitarian assistance this year? That is a 40% increase from last year. So that means we better deal with this or there's going to be all kinds of horrible consequences. Think about the Northern Triangle alone. And this is where a big consensus area is. Address the root causes of conflict and instability. So in the Northern Triangle, what should we be focusing? Gangs, human trafficking, corruption, even climate. There's a consensus that we should be focusing on greater local stakeholder engagement, such as women. There's actually an interest by a lot of people on interagency coordination instead of being more siloed about this, better data collection. But at the end of the day, think about where these crises are. They're really intractable political conflicts, Yemen, Syria, Venezuela, that are driving these problems. The last one I would mention is this. There is that Americans don't want us to go it alone. Almost 80% of Americans believe we should be a leader in the world as long as we do it in a shared leadership role. So we focused on influencing global partnerships. That's the sixth global challenge that we addressed. And what we found as the consensus is there's a great interest to renew diplomatic capacity at State Department, USAID, in order to make sure we have the capacity to do all of the other five challenges that I talked about. Bolster our diplomatic capacity, our foreign service, modernize, make sure there's more diversity, and there's a whole range of ideas that we can talk about. But I want to conclude with this. The bottom line is that COVID, the global pandemic, upended, as we know, everything. It's not the same world as it was a year ago. And therefore, we can't even think about having the same resources. We just completed a very comprehensive, with a lot of experts weighing in, of a needs assessment. What should Congress and the administration actually invest in terms of the needs assessment in order to protect the health, security, and economic interests of the American people? And we took it based on a lot of this reports, consulting with so many of the writers. And we put out that needs assessment about what does it take to invest in pandemic preparedness, to respond to the global and humanitarian crisis, to bolster America's economic competitiveness. And we're doing it, and we put it out just before the administration is going to release their FY22 budget request. It may not surprise you, but we came up with and believe that at least $14 billion additional funds for the FY22 budget is needed. The budget request is coming out Friday. We'll see how close the Biden administration comes to that, and we'll see what Congress does in terms of a bipartisan response. The last 4 years, there's been enormous bipartisan response to reject enormous proposed cuts to what was coming out of the administration, and we're going to see what happens, and we can talk about it in the conversation. So I conclude these opening remarks with a huge thank you to New Hampshire, who's continued to be a voice for believing that America must be engaged in the world because it so deeply is connected to America's interests, economically, our health, and our safety.
Great. Hey, welcome, Liz.
Hey, there's a friend of mine.
I didn't get mentioned during your comments, but it's great to have you here, and I'm going to be moderating.
I need to mention that. Ambassador, you are one of my heroes.
Well, it's nice of you to say, and I have greatly admired the work that you have done, and I'm glad to see that you are on top of things. This is a very unusual year, and I think it's a year of opportunity. And I want to start that out while I begin to collecting. I hope that people will be sending me their questions, and I can be asking them to you, Liz. But I want to start out with something that you talked about right at the very top two of your issues, the issues about economic cooperation. I'm very involved, and I see the real need of the United States to be making investments in these countries, even in China and Russia for that matter, but particularly in Africa and a lot of the emerging economies. Where do you see the ability for us to be shifting money from other areas in the government budgetary departments over to investing in and developing stronger ties with these countries through those investments?
First is, let me just give a shout out. And you and Katrina have been unbelievable in making a difference in the world. Truly, in wearing all your different hats, in Congress, overseas, in New Hampshire, in your private sector, and public sector and philanthropic efforts. So on behalf of all of us, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
And partnering with USGLC has just been extraordinary. When you wrote me about this, I think I took about 30 seconds to say yes. You know, I'm very careful, given when you wear the hat of a very large coalition of 500 businesses and NGOs, you're very careful of talking about where you would take from to give to. So I'm going to be very careful about the specific question, but here's what I would say of where we are underinvesting in. One of the things that I have always talked about is I think we terribly underinvest in our own hemisphere. I can't tell you, and you know this better than most, how many times I hear candidates from both parties run for president, and this has nothing to do with Joe Biden, but for decades talk about we need to spend more time in our own Western Hemisphere, in Central America and Latin America. And then they come into office and there's crises throughout the world and we don't. And we spend peanuts in percentages in our own hemisphere, other than Plan Colombia, which is one of the greatest success stories of narco-terrorist country into a great trading partner. I just had a program where I interviewed and spent time with President Duque of Colombia. And now we are seeing some of the real problems. It's not only because we didn't invest, but it's because we took our foot off the gas pedal, as I said earlier. So I would argue that where it comes from, Congress gets to decide that. I don't get to decide that. But what I can argue is when we walk away from places in the world, somebody else is going to fill them, and we're not going to like who that is, because they play by different rules and we get left out. But when we play, America does really well.
How does a little state like New Hampshire have an impact on solving some of these massive global problems? I know many people in this state who are involved in projects overseas, but they're not really making the kind of impact I think that many of us wish that we could. And part of that problem I'm seeing is that we're not getting that investment to build and to ultimately turn over on itself and to increase opportunities between the two countries, or between the state of New Hampshire and the location where those investments are taking place. How do small states like New Hampshire build that kind of relationship and get the support that they need, that we need, to do these good programs and good projects?
Well, it's a great question. Well, first and foremost is in terms of the macro level of just making sure that America doesn't walk back, that's where you have a very powerful seat. You first have one of the most powerful seats in the land when it comes to every 4 years, of making sure you speak to all those presidential wannabes that come in and out of your homes, literally. The rest of us don't have anybody that comes into our homes. They come into our TV sets. I live in Maryland. They don't walk into my home. So you have a voice that's way bigger than everybody else, and making sure that they understand loud and clear that America cannot withdraw from the world, number one. Number two is your congressional delegation. And I have found them often, if not always, being very, very strong to not only deliver the macro message, but also to deliver the micro message for New Hampshire. And then third, for the individual, which is, I think, where your real question is my experience is the agencies at the agency level that we work with are really interested in the small business, the small NGO. And one of the things that we try to do is try to really help, the small connect to I'm going to use Washington language, TDAs, and the smaller agencies, to make sure we help make the matches. And if we can help do that, that's not what we're centralized to do, but want to be helpful to make sure you know where to go. And I think they really want to help do that and help find that. They're not always big enough to do that, but Exim, who is known for these you know, they're big operations for Boeing and Chevron, these big, but they really, their real bread and butter is the small business operation.
Are you finding that the approach to investment is more to do with giving grants and not tying those kinds of investments to returns and partnershiping, or are you seeing more and more of the kinds of legal connections that these partnerships are creating, that bind people together, that see them realizing the profits from those partnerships over time?
You know, it's been such if you look over the trajectory of maybe the last, I'd say 10 years, it's really changed. A decade ago, I think what government wanted businesses to come in for is, give me your money. You know, can you write a grant? Can you partner? It's so different now. It's really about partnership. Mark Green, very dear friend of mine, who's actually on our board, who was the first USAID administrator in the Trump administration, had it, I think, exactly right. This is about, one, a journey of self-reliance. Most of these countries, not all these countries, or at least from the US, we want these countries to become self-reliant. And most people want to become self-reliant. Who wants to be dependent on someone else? So what we should be doing is we should be using our rare taxpayer dollar to figure out what nobody else will do. And then how do you leverage it so that we can get out of the way and let private sector come in? So what he did is something that was so smart. Instead of saying, here's what we're going to do, we're going to put it all out there, and then at the very end of the day, we're going to have business come in and tell them what we're going to do. He brings business in early on. I'm going into Guatemala. We're going to fix this problem. Business, or whoever, what do you think we should do? He co-created with those that were interested. Now, the question that you're probably next thinking, well, how can some, you know, smaller operation in New Hampshire get into that? That I'm not sure I have the answer, but I will find out.
We would appreciate that. To broaden it a little bit, you talked in the first point about fighting poverty and the problems that poverty has created with regard to fighting the pandemic, if you will. I think that we have seen the most people coming out of poverty in the last 40 years by what has been going on in China. So you have this kind of dichotomy. You're dealing with a system that is authoritarian, that is a centralized government, that is doing bad things with certain groups within their borders. And yet, you know, hundreds of millions of people have made it out of poverty into the lower and middle class sector. So how do we deal with the dichotomy of you know, Hong Kong not being allowed a democratic election process, or the Uyghurs being placed in these refugee camps and being forced to do terrible things, while at the same time China is beginning to grow and blossom as a provider of economic activity for so many of their people, so much so that they are really on the verge of overtaking the U.S. economy as the largest economy in the world.
Oh, I think it's a fabulously question and a very complex question. And I think one of the biggest debates going on right after the election was, what is the administration going to do on their China policy? And one of the things, it was probably one of the most interesting questions that when I hosted Jake Sullivan on a report on reports, was the China question. And is this, you know, continue to be competition, or are we moving to competition and cooperation? And how do you balance this? And this was before I met with him before the Alaska summit. And I think what we are looking at is finding where that tension is. And what's interesting is, if you watch, we just watched Secretary Blinken be very clear where human rights lands in terms of our values and our policy position. And certainly we see that coming out of Congress, again, from both sides of the aisle. The biggest issue that we're watching, one last point I'd make on poverty, very much of our, for years, much of our programs as it relates to responding to poverty was focused on long-term development. In the next decade, 80% of the world's poor are going to be living in fragile and conflict-ridden states. That's a very different kind of addressing poverty. We have to rethink how we do it. We have to get better at it. That is our challenge.
Well, that's a great segue to this next question, because the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition talks about leaders cooperating. And we live in a political world today where everything is polarized. Nobody's willing to work to a compromise. Everybody has to have it their way or it's the highway. And my question to you is, how do you see the USGLC getting people to work together, getting these discussions to take place? Because, I've come up against so many people. We're doing a big project in China where we're trying to create a vertical agriculture center for a community that will employ people and give them opportunity and produce food for a country that is going around the world buying up millions and millions of acres and really dealing in those purchases in a very arrogant and adversarial way that is creating a lot of tension. My feeling is someone's got to get these people to take care of themselves, use that technology, do it in a partnership, get everybody interlocked so that we don't have problems in the future with the conflicts that are being talked about being possible today. So how does the GLC step in and help make that kind of an environment possible? Because I think you've got a lot of work to do if you're going to abide by the definition of your name. So tell me, how does how
do we do it?
Yeah, how do you do it?
It's a lot harder than it used to be. I remember years ago, you did an op-ed. You may not remember this, but you did an op-ed with Charlie Bass. And I remember, and it was along the lines that America needs to be engaged in the world and we need development and diplomacy. It didn't say anything groundbreaking for those of us on this call, but that's what it said. And I got a call from somebody who was running a presidential campaign, the New Hampshire campaign. And he said to me, wow, that caught my attention. Those two guys don't agree on anything. And I thought, there you go. If you can get people to tune in and listen differently. So that's been a lot of how we've done it. So what we do is try to get people to listen, because you know as well as anybody from your days in Washington that one of our biggest problems is people are not listening, and they're tuned into one set of news channels or another set of news channels that are screaming, not talking, and they're not listening. So what we are doing is we're hosting, it used to be in person, now we're doing it virtually, hopefully civil town hall meetings, where members of Congress can talk to their constituents, just like we're doing tonight, and they're talking to business leaders and faith leaders and Rotarians and farmers, and they're listening and hearing them talk about why this matters to them, about programs just like what you're doing in China. And you can tell them that it matters to New Hampshire or it doesn't matter, and we put it all out there. And that's why it makes a difference. And that's why when the last administration put out a call to cut 30% of our footprint in the world, within 2 weeks, 200 members of Congress, Democrats and Freedom Caucus members, said no. And at the same time, I could walk into the Situation Room to the same administration and support policy that was good policy on women economic empowerment or on the Development Finance Corporation. So that's an example of trying to get people to listen. And how did I get in? Because I walked in with credible validators that they would listen to.
I have to take one moment to apologize to all of our viewers. It seems like you and I have this wonderful opportunity to have a tete-a-tete, just the two of us. I am trying to find out how I can get others' questions to you so that you can answer them. I'm covering very badly.
These are really impressive questions.
Here's the first one. It just popped up on my screen. Is there broad bipartisan support for the international engagement? It seems that America first stepped back from global leadership, and I think that's a very important question. So I'll let you take a crack at that.
And I would love you to answer as well what you think. So you're just as thoughtful on these issues as.
I'll let you go first.
You know, it's interesting. We did some polling a few months ago, and I will share with you that we didn't release it. Some we released publicly. We released some publicly right in like May of last year, and I knew there was a shift after COVID, after the global pandemic broke out. There was a wild shift. I mean, 30-point shift of people not just connecting that the world mattered. I see your map behind you, but that we Americans should invest in poor and weak countries' health systems, like invest money that could, that matter to us. The pollster one of our pollsters was the same pollster who worked on the president's reelect. And what he told me is there's like maybe 10% like true isolationists in this world, in this country. But then, and there's, a third that's probably, could be on the World Affairs Councils. Said where a big chunk of America is we've won the battle that we need to be engaged in the world. People get it. They want to buy their things inexpensively. But we have to show that there is a return on investment, that it actually matters to our kitchen table issues. And there's a really good story to tell, but you got to tell it in a succinct way, which is what I meant when I talked about that challenge to all of us on this call.
One of the things that I've been doing for the last 10 years is trying to build a platform that can demonstrate how these projects can be built and how they become very important economic engines, not only for the emerging economies where they're located, and particularly we're working in Africa and we are now working in China, but they also are redounding upon the pocketbooks of the Americans who invest in them as well. And that, I think, is a very, very important way for us to begin to build broader dialogues, broader commitments. And, I think once we have the ability to show that economic opportunity that is good for both countries, then we begin to, I think, turn Americans' heads towards these kinds of things. I would rather be spending what few dollars that come out of my taxpayer obligations on things that are going to grow and return in value than spend them on defense and bombs and bullets. And so I think those are important distinctions to be made, but we are not, I think, doing enough or tracking it well enough to demonstrate to American citizens that those investments are in fact keeping peace across the land. There are two books that I would really recommend everybody who's watching this broadcast read, because I think they talk about these things extremely well. One is a book by a former, a deceased Harvard Business School professor named Clayton Christensen, who was well known for his idea of disruptive innovation. But he's looking at disruptive innovation as a way to eliminate poverty, which is, he looks at the United States back when the Henry Fords were building the assembly line, and we were doing these kinds of things, building the economy in the US. And he says that the disruptive aspect of that was that these people were focusing on the non-consumers. Henry Ford, was building cars for the people who could not afford to buy cars at that time. Well, he made a widget or a car that was for the person who couldn't otherwise consume. And this is what Clayton Christensen is saying we should be doing in these emerging economies. Have them make things that they otherwise couldn't buy. And so it's not their cheap labor that makes inexpensive clothing for rich countries like the United States to purchase. It's their inexpensive labor makes inexpensive goods for them to purchase right there at home. And that's something that we in partnership can help them do. And we can benefit through the profit sharing that takes place through that partnership. The other book is a book by a former physician, a deceased physician from Sweden named Ross Hansling. And Ross, he was basically making the correlation between health and wealth. And what he shows is that no matter what happens, humanity has always gotten healthier and wealthier over time. And he has a great video that is on the internet that's called 200 Countries in 200 Years. Basically shows that everybody is improving. But to do that, you have to have a broader perspective. You can't just focus on climate change. You can't just focus on authoritarian rule. You can't just focus on one of these things. You've got to be able to see this broad conglomeration of complexity, chaotic, and some things, good things that have to be integrated together. And again, that goes back to the word coalition. You've got to build those coalitions, and you've got to create the dialogue that takes place between all of those things in order for the good investments to be nurtured and grow, and the good relationships and the good politics to take place, where people can solve these problems in a cooperative fashion. So that's my approach, and that's what we're trying to do.
That's awesome. That's great.
Next question. So how does democratic backsliding impact the U.S.? Should we care what forms of government other countries have? Or should we mind our own business?
We should care. I mean, of course we should care. One of the things, we work very closely with a couple organizations, the National Democratic Institute, NDI, my friend Secretary Madeleine Albright, and their counterpart IRI, the International Institute of Republican. I'm going to say it wrong. Kelly Ayotte was the chair of it. If I was on their board, that Dan Sullivan is on, and there is some very important studies that have shown about how much COVID has impacted the Democratic backsliding, as the questioner has indicated. And it has had enormous impact, particularly on women and girls, and the most vulnerable, the poor. And we should have great concern about this. One of the things that I think the reason that the report on reports had addressed this, would it have popped in the same way pre-COVID? I don't know. Would Samantha Power, the incoming nominee for USAID, make it rise so high in her confirmation hearings? I don't know. And I think one of the reasons is because people are so concerned about what's happening to the most vulnerable, as to how when democracies decline and authoritarians rise up, who gets hurt. And so we're keeping an eye on that. And one of the things that our needs assessment has shown is that these are the kinds of programs that need to be invested in.
Mm-hmm. I would be curious. Here's another question. I've got one question I'm going to leave for the last, because I'm very curious to hear from you about what you're looking for as far as the USGLC's accomplishments in the coming year. But here's another question I can ask. What can the U.S. do in the face of Chinese human rights abuses that the Chinese government views as a purely domestic issue? For example, do we simply have to sit by as Hong Kong's democracy is snuffed out?
I think that, again, this administration is being pretty loud and clear when it comes to this. We've heard loud and clear from both, from the president on down, and certainly Secretary of State, in being shy about this. And I think they're going to lean very heavily on our allies to join us. So I think this is one area where we're seeing a real shift between administrations in terms of how they're addressing not just human rights, but human rights as it relates to China. And so I think this is a change from the administration side. I think we've always seen a very large and loud voice from Congress. So I think this is going to continue to be a hot topic in Washington, D.C., and I don't see anything changing on that for the near future. Now, whether they will have an impact,
that was my next question.
That's a different story. The rhetoric's going to stay pretty hot on this one.
Okay. While we're waiting for another question to appear, what I would like you to tell us before you get off this wonderful hour that we've had with you is what are your hopes to accomplish this year? And I'd like the best case scenario and maybe not the worst case scenario, but the most realistic scenario. So as you lay out your agenda for the USGLC, what are your hopes and expectations, and how do you think they're going to be realized?
Well, I think everybody in the world is hoping that that the impact on the global pandemic will minimize, and all of us will, from a health and an economic point of view, will ease. And so what's our little piece of the puzzle of that? How does USGLC fit into this? Last year, as Congress and the administration start to work together to say, how do we resource this? How do we deal with this? We looked at it very quickly and said, we cannot stop a global pandemic without a global response. We have to make sure there's a global resources. So we did something we've never done. We always respond to how somebody else puts out a number or resource and a lead. We said we have to lead. So we went out and we looked at what the global needs assessment was. We put out a number of 20 billion, and we had to kind of claw through a lot of competition out there of really, really important needs. But these are needs that were completely connected to our economic and health recovery. $18 billion was included in $5 trillion of resources. So as I said earlier, our top priority is making sure that we have to do that again. This is not the same world as it was a year ago. So how did the world change? Our needs assessment said it changed really dramatically. And we have to invest in pandemic prevention. We have to invest in responding to the global humanitarian crisis. We're going to double the number of people who are famine, who are on the verge of starvation in the world. And in addition to the humanitarian crisis, that has enormous national security impact on us. And we have to make sure that as we've been talking about, that we bolster American competitiveness in the world. So when we look at all of that, that means that we have to put way more resources into what we call the international affairs budget, that little 1% of the federal budget. And we're going to work real hard, whether it can be done in one fiscal year, it'll take two, but that's what we're going to do. And to do that, it's not just about the resources. It's about educating and engaging policymakers about the importance of America's role in the world, because it matters to our health and economic recovery and future safety for every American family. And making that connection in one congressional district, that's what we're going to work on.
What's going to be the most important U.S. partner in this coming year to accomplish these kinds of things? You talked about partnerships being an important part of those 6 initial areas that we need to work on. Who are we going to do this with, and how is that going to make it happen all the more successfully?
Dick, the reality is, and I don't just say it because I'm talking to you, but it's really people like you. I mean, at the end of the day, I live in Washington, D.C. It is you and all the people on this call who go and meet with Senator Shaheen and Senator Hassan and your 2 Congress representatives. And so it's the partners we need are are local voices that have credibility with their members of Congress that can speak to real stories of why. Why does this matter? Why, when you sit around your kitchen table and talk about your economic future for your family, does it matter? So we're doing a what we call, a listening tour throughout the heartland where I grew up. I grew up in the Midwest with some business leaders, and we've been in community college leaders and farmers, and they've been unbelievable. We just listen and bring people together with their members of Congress, small Zoom calls with 15, 20 people, Democrat, Republican, state legislators, mayors, and those are our partners. Our new co-chair is Steve Benjamin from Columbia, South Carolina, as I mentioned before, and he was the former president of the Conference of Mayors. Those are the partners.
Well, we certainly enjoy having you as a partner with the World Affairs Council in New Hampshire, and I'm very grateful for the time that you've given us and the answers that you've given to the few questions that we have been able to have. I'm going to have to talk with you offline. I'm coming up on a 6-country tour in Africa the last week of May and the first 2 weeks of June. We're talking about telemedicine. We're talking about these same kinds of projects of agriculture centered around 10,000 housing communities for people in Africa. So these are things that I need your help on, but I think New Hampshire also appreciates the help that you're giving us at the World Affairs Council to attack these problems, bring solutions, and hopefully we'll have a better year this year than we've had in the 15 past, where things will stop declining and they'll start growing and increasing. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll turn the time over to Tim Horgan to wrap up the program. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, we can't hear you. We can't hear you, Tim. There you go.
The hated, oh, you're still muted. But thank you to Liz and to Ambassador Sweat for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your insights. I think this was a really wonderful conversation. So we just want to wrap up here and mention that our next event will be on April 22nd. We are joining with the Lampos Foundation. Ambassador Sweat's quite involved with them as well, but we are going to be talking about the human rights situation in China. So a wonderful way to tie these two programs together with some of the final questions we have there. We hope that you'll be able to join us 6 p.m. right here on our website, on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So have a wonderful evening. We really appreciate all that you do to support us and to make these programs wonderful. Thank you.